All right, well, good afternoon. It is 1 o'clock by my watch, so thank you for joining us today for our virtual field day. I'm thrilled to have you join us today as we explore this novel concept of saturated waterways. For those of you that are new, thank you and welcome for joining us. For those that are our frequent visitors, thank you again for coming along on this journey. I'm Liz Ripley. I'm our Conservation and Cover Crop Outreach Specialist with the Iowa Learning Farms here located on campus at Iowa State University. We were established in 2004, and our goal is to build a culture of conservation, working with farmers and landowners and researchers, many of those that are going to be speaking today, to implement conservation practices that improve water quality and soil health while helping producers and landowners remain profitable. This is made possible through many partnerships. Particularly today, I want to give a thank you and shout out to our Iowa Nutrient Research Center, who is funding this particular research project. But other partners of the Iowa Learning Farms include our Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, our Iowa Department of Natural Resources, US EPA Section 319, GrowMark, Conservation Districts of Iowa, and the Iowa Soybean Association. So while the video is playing, please, make note of any questions and feel free to submit them to me in the chat. Following the video and a brief discussion of some preliminary results, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and participate together in this conversation about saturated waterways. This virtual field day is being recorded and will be posted to our website this afternoon. Attendees, you will also be receiving a brief email with an evaluation. We appreciate your feedback that will include a link to today's recorded virtual field day. So with that, I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers. They include Keith Schilling. He's our state geologist and director of the Iowa Geological Survey. Matthew Streeter is the Iowa Geological Survey soil scientist. Jen Merryman is an Iowa State University Natural Resources Ecology and Management University Assistant Teaching Professor. And Clark Porter is the gracious landowner joining us from Porter Family Farms, where this practice has been implemented. So thank you. Let's head to a much warmer day as we learn a little bit more about these saturated waterways.
Keith Schilling, State Geologist, Director of the Iowa Geological Survey. As you drive around, you see waterways across the countryside, and these are a very common conservation feature. Work that we've done elsewhere, starting at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, we've been looking at the subsurface properties of grass waterways and see that where they are placed on the landscape, they hold tremendous potential for nitrate reduction. These waterways essentially are filling drainage ways or old ancestral gullies with eroded sediment from the uplands containing a lot of organic matter. Their location on the landscape is low on the topography, therefore they're wet. And so these are ideal conditions for nitrate reduction on the landscape. Many of these waterways are tiled, so they'll tile them to keep them dry, allow traffic to access across the waterways. What we're talking about here with this saturated waterway idea is reconnecting the tile drainage that's draining these systems to the locations where we see all these potential nitrate reductions occurring. So these are ideal settings for nitrate reduction equivalent to saturated buffers. We do not have, in this case, we've just constructed our first test practice and the data is slowly rolling in. It looks very effective. What we've seen elsewhere is we've done studies where we've measured concentrations in the upland areas surrounding the waterway, and what we see is a 70 to almost 100% reduction of upland nitrate being reduced in the waterway sediments. In this case, we're trying to manage that system a little bit and say, how can we reconnect the tile drainage to the waterway to achieve even greater mass reduction? But where it's relatively untiled, we do see all the upland water, groundwater flowing into the waterway, and all those concentrations are reduced significantly. This practice is really has tremendous opportunity to scale. Just about everybody has a grass waterway on their land. Anywhere there's a slope coming together to convey water downstream. So just about everybody has one, and this is a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on that. Where the system that we're designing here, it's expanded because we're testing the efficiency here at Clark Porter's farm. But as a practice going forward, it's going to be relatively simple to install. Probably simpler than other equivalent practices. So I feel like there's a tremendous potential to capitalize on these existing grass waterways for serious nitrate reduction. Yeah, this study is a partnership with Clark Porter, the landowner, and staff at Iowa State University and the University of Iowa. So this is a true collaboration across the state's regions universities. This work is funded by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center.
Hi, my name is Jen Merryman. I am a master's student at Iowa State University working on saturated grass waterways. My role in this project is I am really the person that collects most of the data in the field. I come out every week, typically once a week, sometimes more if there's more precipitation in the area. And I grab groundwater samples from the monitoring wells that you can see behind me. And I also take water samples from the incoming tile so that we can take those samples back to the lab and analyze them to see what level nitrate we have in them. And so we can see the reduction process that's happening as the water flows through the grass waterway. I also like to take samples of the depth of the water within the wells and in the control boxes so that we can see how the water is flowing through the system as well and see the response time to precipitation events. So during my undergrad, I worked as a research assistant, as an undergrad research assistant in the same Streams and Buffers lab with Dr. Tom Eisenhart, and I had the opportunity to really get involved in a lot of different water quality projects. And when this opportunity was presented to me to come out and help research this novel idea of taking a saturated buffer concept and moving it into a grass waterway, I was really excited because this will really open up the door to a lot of potential nutrient reduction happening in the state.
Hey, my name is Matthew Streeter. I'm a soil scientist at the University of Iowa Geological Survey. I have been working with Keith Schilling for about 10 years now on water quality projects to improve water quality around the state. Usually these are edge of field practices. Because I'm a soil scientist, I like working with soil health. We like to use the soil to improve the water. And here we are in Rhinebeck. We're at Clark Porter's farm, and we have another opportunity to get even closer to the field with what we're calling a saturated grass waterway. And so a lot of people are familiar with saturated buffers, and those go along riparian zones. They're put in level along creeks. This is very similar to a saturated buffer in a lot of respects, except what we're doing now is moving up a grass waterway. So we're actually increasing in elevation, and we're allowed to get into a lot of these high organic matter systems that are otherwise inaccessible for saturated buffers. So as far as the NRCS is concerned, typically you're not allowed to put saturated buffers anywhere that's not flat. We want to be able to use the organic matter. The saturated waterways in this case are chock full of organic matter. We've probably got 5% organic matter at depth here. Now, one of the things that we're worried about with farmers and moving into grass waterways that are in fields is still being able to drive through those waterways. So what we've done here, and kind of different from a saturated buffer, is we're keeping the water lower. So we have water tables that generally rise almost to the ground surface for a saturated buffer. The water tables here need to stay within maybe a foot to even 2 feet below ground surface so that farmers can still move through them. And so what we have here is a very unique design for a saturated grass waterway, and we're using water gate structures through agri-drain. Here we are standing at the lower control structure. So in a real world application, if we were going to install this at a farmer's property, this would be the only control structure that would be above ground. Everything else in the practice is going to be below ground. And that's what's so great about the saturated grass waterway is the farmer can still move through the field. So everything else is all about the science. Even everything above this structure, these solar panels and these control boxes, it's all really about the science. So we have a rain gauge on top. We're collecting flow data with a control box here. This lower control box is giving us live nitrate data. And so that's what all of these sensors are doing. And I'm going to pop open this box here. And we have a couple of cables. We have a live flow that's being recorded with a radar sensor. And we can maybe get a picture of that, I'm not sure. And in the very bottom of the practice, we have a nitrotax sensor that's giving us live nitrate readings. Now, this control structure, what it's doing is it's giving us our initial water table rise. So let's say that we want to saturate our grassed waterway 2 feet above the perforated tile. So in this case, we have a perforated tile running right down the middle of the grassed waterway. We want to take care of that organic matter. We want to saturate the organic matter that's maybe 2 to 4 feet below ground surface. And so we're going to put, for example, a 2-foot gate in this structure. That's going to give us a 2-foot water table elevation rise. We saturate the buried organic matter in the waterway. But as we move upslope, you can imagine that the water is going to stay level, but the ground surface goes up. So if the water stays level and the ground surface stays up, we kind of have a law of diminishing returns. So as we move up on the landscape, this 2 foot of saturation is going to be diminished and gone. So we have 2 foot of elevation rise here at the structure. But then, as we move up 1 foot of elevation rise, we placed a water gate. So where the water gate's at, which is about 100 feet away, we had a foot of elevation rise, which means we're only saturated about 1 foot now. We've lost 50% of our saturation. The water gate gives us another foot back. So we get all back to our 2 foot of saturation where that water gate's at. And then we continue to do that and stair step up the waterway until we got our 5 feet of elevation rise at the top of the practice. I am definitely an applied scientist. I have a farming background. I grew up on a farm, and I like things that farmers like. I realize that a lot of farmers don't want to have to farm through things. They don't want to have to farm around things. And saturating a waterway to the surface defeats the purpose of the waterway. For one, we need to be able to move water off the top of the field. We also can't have water saturating at the surface because we're going to cause gully erosion and things like that in our waterways. It can't happen. What we have in Iowa are these unique waterway systems that are full of organic matter. So we've had erosion that's happened, they're naturally wet spots, and we have a lot of organic matter. Now, because we're in Iowa and we have farming and erosion, a lot of the organic matter that used to be at the ground surface is now buried. So we have post-settlement alluvium or post-settlement eroded materials that are sitting on top of high organic matter in these waterways. So we have to have organic matter, of course, to denitrify, but if it's at depth, we might not actually need to saturate all the way to the ground surface. You don't have to saturate to the ground surface because the organic matter is at depth. So I said, what if we just saturate part of the soil profile, not to the ground surface, but just part of it? And so I was working with Charlie Schaefer at AgriDrain, and we were talking about some different options, and he told me about these drainage control gate structures. They call them water gates. And we were talking about how we can get a foot of elevation rise with those. And in doing so, we have a grass waterway system where we have the elevation rise, but we don't have anything at the top, and we're not saturating all the way to the ground surface. So far, we're seeing, coming out of the drought, we weren't exactly sure how water would be moving through, but so far we're seeing that the practice has been completely full for about 3 months now. So water started moving through the practice in January, really in mid-February. To late February, the practice completely filled up with water, and we are now moving water out of the overflow at the top, and we're bypassing the practice. So we've taken somewhere around and this is kind of a guess, but somewhere around maybe 80% of the water has actually been contained in the practice, and the rest has been overflowed. So we're taking a huge amount of the water. As far as the water quality information is concerned, we haven't analyzed a lot of that data yet. We have samples that are being collected from all of these wells, and so that's still pretty preliminary. Once it stops raining, things slow down, probably in June, we're going to start looking at that data a lot more.
My name is Clark Porter, and I'm the manager for Porter Family Farms, for our family farm. And the reason that we've participated in this project is because it presents a tremendous opportunity. If we can treat nitrates in waterways, as opposed to some of the standard practices that we have right now for edge-of-field treatment of drainage, such as bioreactors or saturated buffers, and saturated buffers in particular. With saturated buffers, we're just confined to stream banks. We have 2 saturated buffer lines on our farm. But as long as we're confined only to stream banks with those, we're going to be limited in the amount of drainage that we can treat. But if we can work with grassed waterways, then we have just exponentially increased available area for natural filtration of the nitrates. I was particularly curious, as you know, being involved with farming and farm production, is the degree to which the waterway would still function as a waterway. We know that we can find out already that it's functioning in terms of handling the water, and that treating the water, handling the water, staging the water table up the waterway, all of that appears to be working according to the measures we have. The next thing, of course, is that we can't compromise its functioning as a grassed waterway, because grassed waterways also provide a lot of ecological benefits, and we can't compromise that. And thus far, it's been interesting. I've been out here after some of the really heavy rains we've had this spring, and this has been this has been a very wet spring. And this waterway has been no wetter than our other waterways, and it's dried out just as fast as the other waterways. So I'm pleased to see that. We've got some improvements that we need to do to the waterways subsequent to the construction and putting this, this system in place. And there's some improvements I need to do to this waterway anyway. We're always struggling to maintain waterways. That's just, waterways need maintenance. But we're going to be able to do all that and still have this thing function. And I think an important thing to point out to other farmers and farm managers is that the equipment you see here, the instrumentation up the waterways, the standpipes that we're using to measure nitrates, none of that would be there in a normal system. All you'd have is this little box at the bottom, and that would be it. And if all of this works, that's the only thing that any other one like this would have. We're planting today. It's a little late. Once again, been a very wet spring, but everything's going well. We've got the edges of the waterway conducive to planting here. Even though we've got, we're stair-stepping the subterranean pools of water up the waterway a little ways, that is staying within the waterway. I was driving through the waterway last night with a compact utility tractor. It was same, the ground conditions were the same as I've encountered elsewhere on the farm. So all of that's, I'm pleased to see all of that working. It's a small price to pay for us, very small, non-existent really, to participate in this research and to try to help out with the nitrate issues and with drainage issues that we have in the state. And I want to, if I may, put a little pressure on everybody out there that when you have an opportunity to treat your nitrates in the water and to treat nutrient pollution in the state, either with practices in your field or edge-of-field practices, and ideally we need to layer these. Farmers, we need to do this. This is imperative because we're finding more and more difficulties, more and more problems with nitrates. But the nitrate output in Iowa is nothing to brag about, and we all can play a role in it. Whether it's planting cover crops, putting in saturated buffers, reducing your nitrogen inputs, managing those things. This can be done and still stay profitable and still be productive. And so I would really urge everybody to get involved, contact your local soil and water conservation districts, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, NRCS. There's county offices. There's offices in every county in the state. And talk with people about what you can do on your farm.
All right.
Well, hello,
Very well
everybody.
said.
Oh, go ahead,
Yes.
Liz.
Oh, that's fine, Keith. You're on top of it. Here we go.
Okay. Thanks everybody for attending, and I think this is an exciting opportunity that it's facing us right now. I think there is so much potential. You heard me say that. I believe it. Um, we're finished year one of our monitoring, and it was not a normal year, although anymore I don't know what normal is, but we did get some heavy rainfalls in the spring on with shoulders roughly of drought. That we have looked at the hydrologic data collected year one. Clark can tell more about the planting, but it was a soybean year that year. Matthew in the video said maybe he was treating 80% of the water. Well, it turned out it was 60% of the water based on our flow monitoring, which is okay, really, because I feel like the events we had were really, really large runoff events. So I'm not sure anything would have been able to capture some of that excess water. But if we had a more, quote unquote, normal hydrologic season, we'd have more water on the shoulders in March and April, and then post fall that we didn't really capture much this year. But super encouraging. The table on the right shows how many days with treated or untreated flow. So really, we had 9 days where we had bypass flow for the entire year. But those 9 days were kind of a doozy, again, because of the excess rainfall. So super encouraging with the hydrologic practice, how it's working. Clark mentioned how the waterway was not any wetter than any other waterway around. So we're keeping the water intact in place, and the hydraulic conductivity or the capacity of the sediments to take that excess water, it looks like so far so good. It seems to be taking all the water it can handle outside of some extreme events. Next slide. We haven't analyzed necessarily all the groundwater wells, but we can with our nitrotac sensors. The graph on the upper right shows the time series of nitrate concentrations entering the grass waterway from the watershed. You can see the concentrations rose a little bit in April. We're a little bit higher, decreased in the post August September period, and then it had a minor rise. The pattern is very similar. Concentrations, because again, it was maybe the soybean year, are not as high as we might have expected from a long-term crop field, but they are what they are. Overall, the practice saw 631 pounds of nitrate into the practice and treated 377 pounds, with the bypass delivering 254 pounds around the practice. Now, the only way we're really going to know how the practice is working as far as treating that water is that because it's seeping that water with the Watergate structure into the waterway, is to analyze the groundwater wells in the waterway. All indications are, outside of one well at the very bottom, that we'll figure it out later, all the wells had concentrations less than 0.5 milligram per liter. So it would appear at this early stage that waterway is handling 377 pounds of nitrate delivered with that water and treating nearly all of it. So also very, very encouraging in terms of the performance. And more to come. We'll analyze the groundwater wells. I think we really need year 2 of this practice to see what the performance is across a second hydrologic season, but could not be more thrilled with the early performance so far. So we'll expect to be treating or quantifying more down the future. So at this point, I'll sign off with these two graphs. I don't know if others have more to add on the monitoring that we've done, but that's the latest information that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Keith. And as a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat. We have had some come in already. And kind of while we're still on this topic, there's a question specifically, I'll direct this one to you, Keith, but where is the treated flow being measured compared to the untreated flow?
Well, I'm going to turn that to Matthew. Matthew's been heavily in the design. I could do it, but I want Matthew to weigh in on that.
So at the upper end of the saturated grass waterway, we have a second aggredrain control structure, and it's a 3-chamber control structure. And we have flow that's coming in with nitrate data into that first chamber. The second chamber is where we're actually diverting water into the practice. And then we have another flow meter in the third chamber that is measuring untreated flow. So it's all happening at the top end of the practice where we're either treating or not treating that incoming tile water. So in a real world situation, if we were to implement this, we would do away with that upper control structure and we would simply divert the tile lines into and out of the practice without that control structure. But to allow us to see what is being treated and not treated, we have that second control structure, that 3-chamber box at the top.
Thank you. Couple design questions here. So I'll ask them together, but how steep of slope do you anticipate you can use this on? And is there a minimum width necessary for the waterway designed to function?
So I don't think that specifically there's a cutoff for how steep of an elevation you can go through. But so for example, here at Clark's, we've got about a foot of elevation rise over about 100 feet of run. So we're raising 5 feet over a 500-foot waterway approximately. We could do shorter and you would put the water gates closer together, or you could go something longer with less elevation rise and put them farther apart. Really, the big question here is what are we able to treat? So, of course, if we get on a steeper waterway, you'll have less length between those water gates and you'll be treating less water. And that's one of the big questions that we have is how big do these need to be? How long is sufficient? And so this practice, the very first one we ever installed, just happens to be 100 feet between these water gates, and we're getting about 5 feet of elevation rise. But that's not to say that that's appropriate or anything like that. We really don't know. Furthermore, we don't know how much of the practice we're actually going to be using. So one of the goals with all of the monitoring wells is to see when those water gates are actually activated. So we don't know out of the 4 water gates and essentially the 5 different sections of the saturated grass waterway, we don't necessarily know, except when it's clear full, if we're only using 2, 3, 4, or 5 sections, unless we're overflowing, then it's obvious that we're using all of them. So that's one of the questions that we have is, how much water can we actually take?
I'll also add one more comment. A design consideration is going to be the hydraulic conductivity of the soils in the waterway itself. If they're, super clay rich, maybe in some areas of the state, they're not going to be as receptive to taking excess water, seepage water, and moving it. And so you may not get as much treatment in super clay rich waterway soils compared to one that might be a little sandier. So Clark's farm is up in the Iowa erosion surface, the landform area kind of in northeastern Iowa, tend to be sandier, which I think is also a good place to start. And I think as we get more of these in, we might see the impacts of some of the variables that Matthew talked about, and see how well, this practice might work at a range of conditions.
So one thing that didn't really come through in the video and wasn't mentioned is that in the case of Clark's, because of that, potential concern about low conductivities, saturated hydraulic conductivities, we installed laterals within the grassed waterway to extend the length of the perforated tile. So rather than just having one tile in the center of the waterway that's 500 feet long, by putting laterals in perpendicular to that across that grassed waterway, we've essentially doubled the length of perforated tile in that system. So allowing that interaction with that soil to increase quite a bit. And again, with where we're sitting right now, I can't really say quite yet if that's necessary or not, but that's one of our goals to answer that question as we move forward.
So you mentioned the design specifically. There's a question here of what is the surface watershed and subsurface drainage areas for this particular site, if you know those offhand.
I do not.
I know.
So
Same. If Elliot Anderson is on this Zoom, he was looking into that, and I don't think we ever got the answer from him. Clark, do you know offhand? Jen?
Yeah, I think the surface drainage area was about 21 acres, I believe. It's a pretty small drainage area compared to some of the other ones that I've looked at, but it has water flowing to it almost all year though. So it's got water coming.
Yeah, we do have some lateral lines running into it further up to some that we just tied in a little bit more this year, so that should be a kind of a dynamic feature of the research here. This is not pattern tiled, but I now have one more lateral coming into the side. So yeah, would you say, Jen, about 20 some acres drainage area? Yeah.
Which is
That would make sense.
the
I would
size?
say it's probably a little more in the on up a ways, just with that lateral extending it a little bit. But yeah,
I think that's a size very equivalent to saturated buffers or bioreactors. It's kind of a field level, edge of field practice, you know, based on topography in this case, more so than straight pattern tile. But that's about roughly the size of many of these edge of field practices.
that's one
Yeah,
thing
I
that's
pulled up
kind of
my GIS map and it is 21 acres for the
okay.
drainage.
So this is
I
just a
did.
clarification question, because just so that I'm on the same page, but someone had asked this, clarifying that there are tile lines from the field discharging to the tile in the waterway, or is there primarily surface water being delivered to the waterway that's being treated? So if you could clarify
So
on that.
So there is no subsurface tile line discharging within the practice. So those tile lines that were existing that were coming to that waterway to begin with, we actually disconnected those. We cut those and we took a non-perforated line and took those on out to the stream in a non-perforated line. So the only water, we hope, that we're actually getting in the practice is tile water from above the waterway. So it's not surface water. It is tile water, but it's tile water from above the practice. We're not taking on additional tile water below that upper control gate.
If I could add to that, to help clarify the like what Matthew is saying prior to this, that we had kind of the standard tile situation with tile lines running on the shoulders of the waterway, but we put that one in the center, and we channel the water into that one so we can treat it, and but the field itself is not pattern tiled. But I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking for the scientists here, but this I'm impressed with the degree to which this could be scaled up or scaled down, and I think this practice could handle pattern tiling, just depending on your waterway and your situation.
And kind of related to that, there's a question in here, and I'm guessing this is sedimentation concern, but would this still work if terraces are connected to the tile? And what size tile do you anticipate this working with? Those two different questions on the design side.
So, We've done a lot of work and are still doing work on modifying these standing tile inlets behind terraces and converting those over to blind inlets because you can't have those in a saturated buffer condition because we're worried about plugging up the buffers. I think that's identical to the problems faced right here in the saturated grass waterway. If you've got a lot of standing tile inlets above this thing, there's probably a pretty high potential, especially if you're not a no-till farmer with cover crops, that you're going to start having some plugging issues and fill these things up. So to plug for blind inlets, that's why we're really promoting stacking these practices across the landscape, because when you get more opportunities for nutrient processing, you're slowing the water down and allowing that to happen, but you're also keeping that sediment where it should be. Now, as far as tile size is concerned, I don't see a problem with any tile size working. It just so happened that the tile size we were working with here at Clark's was a relatively small size. I think they 4-inch Clark? I'm trying to recall now, but the water gates are actually built for 8-inch tile, I think standard. So there's no problem with scaling those up at all.
So the big question, what is the cost of one of these systems?
So each individual water gate, I think, is right around $500. So if you imagine the cost of a saturated buffer and add $2,000, and you have that saturated grass waterway. So if you can put in a saturated buffer, I mean, they're, without cost share for maybe $5,000 or something like that, you're probably looking at $7,000 to put in a saturated grass waterway. Of course, that doesn't include any of the sensors or anything like that, but I think that's an approximate cost.
So the installation was roughly like one day of a tile contractor for the most part. So
Yeah.
it's not too elaborate, and we probably went overboard with some things in terms of multiple water gates and the laterals and stuff that we did. So yeah, I think that 5,000 to 7,000 is probably a ballpark.
So a question here, the proportion of treated and untreated flow is about the same from May to July, but the total flow was much higher in May. So the question is, how is the water table able to treat so much water in May when it doesn't appear to treat very much in June and July? Is this because the soil is quite dry prior to May, or could this be because the practice was newly installed, or some combination of those factors?
Very nicely specific question, but I feel like we probably haven't dug into it a lot yet. Those events, it must be, we just must be, make sure that we clarify how big those events were. Clark, Matthew, recall the amount of...
For sure. Elliot was mentioning, who analyzed this data, that, a huge majority of the untreated flow occurred over just a couple of event days. So we had these really large events where we had the majority of the untreated flow. And so if flow were, over the same period of time always, then we would expect, treatment to be the same rate. But when you overwhelm the practice, and one day with one big event and you lost, 20% of the total flow, that might be an exaggeration, but that's really what's happening, is these really large events where you just can't take it and you're overwhelmingly losing a lot of water untreated during those just small number of days.
I would say if we could take that same amount of water and distribute it over a month, it would treat it all. It's just that it came so fast. So, the seasonal things, I think, again, we'll see with another year of data, and, hopefully we'll have something that resembles normal a little more than this past year.
Yeah, because if you remember, and I'm sure most of the landowners do remember, it melted at the end of January last year and did not stop with the flow and the precipitation for quite a while. It was just large amounts frequently for a long time. So like he said, once we get a regular flow, if there is regular anymore, then yeah, we'll probably see much better treatment rates.
So this is an interesting question too, as you're maybe considering additional demonstration sites, but do you feel that short native grasses would help with denitrification? And do you think this practice could be applicable with something like prairie strips?
Hmm. So
Yes, we and as in grad school, that was actually one of the things that I was set out to do, was to try to find prairie strips that we could modify to test this practice on as well. And we looked for a long time, and it was very difficult to find terrain with prairie strips on it where the tiling would actually work for the system that we had. Oftentimes, the tile would intersect the prairie at 90-degree angles and have lots of pattern tiling going across it. But the good news is that we think we found some sites, and we're going to be testing that in the future. We just don't have that in place yet. In theory, we think yes. It's right now just finding the right topography and the right site to do it at.
Yeah, so
And
this,
something to keep in mind, like as far as a location like Clark's in the middle of a cornfield, these are primarily grassed waterways that need to convey surface water off the slope. And so we need to make sure that we're still using appropriate species to do that. Just keep that in mind, in that kind of a situation.
Yeah, we probably failed to make that as clear as we could have in the video. Like, this is an erosion control practice, putting grass in these waterways. And so we're not losing that primary purpose here. We're just adding a second, stacked value here in these systems. So it's still going to have its primary purpose, and that means vegetating them with the appropriate species for erosion control, number one.
there's a couple questions in here asking us kind of specifically how do the control structures actually raise the water table? Is it water pressure? Like, how are those water structures, those water valves, increasing and raising the water table?
They're just totally a physical block that's being placed within that gate that's creating 2 feet of head. So you can put in these gates that are 5 or 8 or 10-inch gates that we're calling them, but they're just blocks of plastic that are literally just backing up water, creating a head pressure behind them. So they're very easily manipulated too. I should note that. So if we start with 2 feet of rise and we want to add another 5 inches and do something different, you can easily do that. Or maybe you start with 2 feet and you're like, no, that's a little too wet. You can drop it 6 inches. The water gates will function the same. They're always going to give that 1 foot of rise, but it's based off of that initial gate and rise that you put at the bottom of the structure.
Yeah, so you're backing up water from that lower gate with adjustable panels. And so you control the system at the downstream box.
So a question for you, Clark. You mentioned that the grass waterway did need some maintenance. How long has it been a grass waterway before you came in and established this new saturated grass waterway practice?
That's been a grass waterway as long as I can remember. The farm's been in the family for about 150 years, and it's been a waterway there for as long as I can remember back. So at least 50 or 60 years.
I'll throw this out to the group too. Question specifically, addressing the erosion concern, because again, that was what waterways are designed to do. Does it help to no-till the small area of the field above the grassed waterway and next to the shoulders? Any suggestions to reduce forming gullies along the grassed waterway shoulders?
Yes, the more no-till, the better.
Yeah. We are no-till. We do 100% no-till on that farm. Yeah, that's always, I think I mentioned in the video, problems with waterway maintenance. That's always an issue with waterways, of course, is that you end up having water channeling along the side of the waterway. They move. I mean, there's always maintenance that needs to be done so that so water actually goes into the waterway. And I have found, since we converted to no-till, just a lot less soil moving everywhere on the farm, no matter what. Even even when we tried our best practices at minimum till, we'd still sometimes get little miniature rivulets that would form at the top of a waterway. And converting to no-till has been able to control all of that quite well for us. So I'm sure that helps. But I fully expect that we're going to continue to need to do the kind of waterway maintenance that we need to do at all times, keeping it wide enough, you know, just avoiding spraying, avoiding getting ruts in it, all those kinds of things.
So
So some of that maintenance was, from the installation was created. Some of the larger areas were created when we installed the water gates. So, the tiles plowed in, but each
Hmm.
water gate you actually have to take a backhoe and dig a hole and install this water gate. You saw in the video, they're fairly large. And so, of course, each one of those areas was kind of messed up in the field. And so that takes a little bit of extra time to settle and then regrade and do those things more than just, sinking a tile. So that's something to think about. It does take extra effort.
there's kind of a hypothetical question here. In an era of hotter and drier summers, might holding water on the landscape between rain events lead to increased yields in the vicinity of the waterway?
I think there's remains to be seen a little bit. I think when we dig into the well data and we have water level transducers in all these wells up and down the waterway, we're going to see how extensive the water level rise is out in the landscape. So remains to be seen, but it's an interesting question because we are hopefully saturating the width of the waterway. We'll be able to pick that up with the water level monitoring that we have going on.
And there's a couple of questions here that actually I think are somewhat asking the same question about treating possibly two tiles on the shoulders of grass waterways that had been constructed using NRCS designs, where they would have placed them on the edges versus the center of the waterway. Jen's shaking her head.
Are you saying the feasibility of just modifying those? Is that what the question's asking? Can we just modify those
I think
tiles?
so. Or could this, I guess these water gates, do they need to be at the bottom in the
Mhm.
center versus using tile that's existing on the edges?
So remember that the reason this is working is because we are interacting with that buried organic matter, and so we are in a channel type environment that fills up with organic matter, and usually they're not very wide. So this buried A horizon doesn't necessarily extend very far beyond the width of that grass waterway anyways. So the effectiveness of the practice just being out in the middle of the field probably wouldn't be very effective because at depth, there's not that much carbon. It specifically works in the middle of the waterway where we have the carbon.
But I could easily see a situation if you had tiles draining both sides of a waterway, converging those towards a waterway tile in the middle. And so I don't think it has to be limited to one on one side or anything. It's getting some drainage and seepage out in the middle of the waterway where the conditions are optimal.
Mhm.
And so just a clarifying question someone had asked, you know, saturated waterways are taking waterways that are helping with soil erosion, which would help with phosphorus loss, and adding in the component of reducing nitrogen loss from the system. So kind of getting the best of both worlds in terms of our two main nutrient concerns. There's a clarification question here. In this system, where is the untreated flow going? Does it join up with the tile that was already there, or does it have a surface outlet? What's going on with that?
The untreated flow goes directly back to the original tile and it outlets below that lower control structure. So right below the control structure at the bottom of the waterway, we tied them all back together and they go right back to the stream, exactly where they did before, or approximately.
All right, we'll take a couple more questions, and then I've got a few slides I need to share, and then we'll see what time remains for questions. Do the boards in the water control structure need to be manipulated to keep the water gates gravity flowing at full capacity during times of high saturation, or is there a bypass at each of the water gates during large events?
The system works by filling the lowest water gate first. So if you only have a little bit of water, you might only be processing things in that very first section, maybe the first 100 feet. But as you get more water, the water gate will eventually close and you'll start filling and you stair step up. So you're always filling the bottom one and then you'll eventually fill it until it's at capacity. So it fills from the bottom up. And then when it's completely full, you're bypassing at that point downslope, next to the waterway.
And like Matthew said earlier, that's one of the things we want to test with, again, with the water levels in the wells is seeing when these water gates are actually activated based on the water level patterns that we see. So, we don't really know at this point how many of those have been activated, how full the entire system has been, and we'll see.
All right, I'm going to quickly share my slides. There are a few more questions I want to get to, but just want to be sure that if you attended today's virtual field day, oops, I got the questions in front of that, sorry, and would like to earn a CCA CEU, please email me. That's EJUCHEMS at iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today, and I will get that submitted to the CCA board for that credit. If you are interested in maybe saturated waterway, but any of these other edge of field practices that we can provide your contact information for someone from the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship to follow up with you to see if your site is compatible with one of these practices. We'd be happy to make that connection for you. If you have attended one of our webinars already this year, you've seen this slide, but if not, we are asking folks to complete a voluntary demographic survey. You can find that either by quickly scanning this QR code here or visiting the website URL iowalearningfarms.org/survey. It's a brief survey, it should take maybe 2 minutes. And once you do it for the year, you're done. So if you've done it for one of our webinars already, thank you. If you have not, please consider doing so for us. Again, that's iowalearningfarms.org/survey. You can find this quick demographic survey. And in about a month, we'll be coming back and looking at precision planting of cereal rye to mitigate corn seedling disease and yield drag. So I hope that you can join us again. And as always, the virtual field days are recorded, so you can always find them on our website. And I'll quickly go back here. Again, if you were looking for that CCA CEU email, I'll also put it in the chat for everyone to access and just copy and paste. But while I'm doing that, feel free to submit, again, any questions that you have for the group with our time remaining. And let's see what I have still awaits us here. Is there likely to be any limit on how much nitrogen the soil can treat over time in the system?
I'm not aware of any. I'm going to pull Tom Eisenhart out of the chat and say, in terms of saturated buffers, have you seen any limits that you've got a lot more experience with the long-term duration of those practices?
No, we have not. There was because the process is denitrification, that bacterial process relies on carbon and low oxygen levels. There's enough carbon in these systems that is continually replenished, that there is no limit. There's no buildup of nitrogen in the system, and there's no limit on their ability to treat. There was an earlier question about short grasses, and we found that we've seen little difference between any of the grass species, short, cool season, warm season, short, tall, in terms of their ability to provide that carbon. It's just get that perennial vegetation out there. Although that said, I certainly in this landscape position, those shorter grasses are going to be beneficial. But in other landscape positions, might be other good reasons to plant some of the taller native grasses for habitat. But carbon is not an issue. Nitrate accumulation is not an issue.
There's a question here of whether or not you're going to be looking at any kind of soluble P within these systems as well when you were collecting those grab samples?
Yeah, that would be part of our standard suite of analyses. So Jen and Tom I haven't really looked much at the well data at all. Have you run those at all? No. So
Not for phosphorus, no.
Yeah, we'll be picking that up starting this year.
Excellent. So, something to look forward to and updates on this practice, and maybe something that could help us visualize, and we can maybe help with that is some sort of what the tile system looks like that's coming into this and how the tile's all connected, to help visualize how this saturated waterway connects to all the tile within the field, what it connects to and what it doesn't. So the question here is, can someone speak to any long-term experiences with these control structures and the newer inline ones used here as it relates to sediment buildup and tile lines? They mentioned that their long-term tile contractor is concerned that the lines will silt out and plug if they can't flow.
Yeah. Matthew, you got an idea on that, or Tom?
I mean, just to kind of, ramble here just a little bit. The great thing about this system, as I see it, is that we're on a slope and we have a control structure at the bottom, and those gates are totally removable. So if you had a concern about these potentially plugging up, all you do is pull all the gates and allow a good, flush of the system, so to speak. And I think it's totally flushable, especially because it's on a slope, even, way more so than a saturated buffer where you're diverting water, perpendicular to the tile and then, kind of running back into the same box to overflow. This is truly in line, and I think you could wash it out if that were to become a problem. Keith and I are starting a new project just next year that's going to be looking at sedimentation and buildup in saturated buffers, and then we're looking at converting tile inlets in the catchment for these things and looking at the benefits of removing those tile inlets. So that's definitely a question that we're thinking about, and it's not immediately going to be installed in the saturated grass waterway, but we're going to be doing it in the saturated buffer situation just starting this spring. So
I wanted to add something to it. In my past work for Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, we had a flood on that occurred in the banks along a standard saturated buffer, and we got a bunch of soil and silt that lodged, that kind of backed up from the creek itself into the control structure. And I just opened up all the gates and I was able to flush it out within. I just left and came back the next day. I'm not sure how long it took to wash out. I suspect it was a matter of just an hour or two, but it flushed all out. Also, there might be some confusion because there certainly was with me about these gates. Sometimes it takes a little bit of rehearsal. There, maybe everybody in the audience here understands the gates, but just in case, the inline gates actually open up when there's a lot of water, and they're hinged, so they shut when there's less. So when there's a lot of water and you've got the opportunity, you might have more potential silt flowing through your system. It's at full, it's flowing full capacity anyway, and it's that pulsing that I have faith that pulsing is going to be keeping it clear, and it's at a slope, as Matthew said too. It's not as if we're having a level area where the silt and water could pool. So time will tell, but I have a degree of confidence that we're not really going to see this plug up at any greater rate than any other tile might.
Excellent. And Matthew mentioned modified blind inlets, and as a shameless plug, I put it in the chat, but we did a virtual field day on that, so you can see that installation process and check out that practice by visiting our events page in our field day archive. And I think one last question here, and maybe Tom can jump in on this based on his experience with saturated waterways or saturated buffers. But the question is, when will cost share be available for this practice? Because it sounds like it's very, interesting to people. They want to do this. So when might we see a standard? How long does that typically take, Tom?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically about this practice because there might be other avenues for cost share available. But if we're talking specifically the traditional method of establishing a conservation practice standard within RCS and an interim practice standard, um, that practice, after the data is collected, that practice takes about 12 to 18 months to get the interim standard and longer, a little bit longer for the full standard.
I would say we're also like at the total infancy of this practice. We've got one site years. So, another effort to shameless plugs. If there's people that really want to do it, not saying that we can get this level of monitoring everywhere, but again, as Tom's experience with saturated buffers go, you need more than a single site to make the case how effective this practice is.
Yeah, agreed.
So I can be that conduit, or you can simply, search for Keith or Matthew's name online and reach out to them directly. But with that, we have hit 2 o'clock and I want to respect everyone's time. So thank you all so much for participating today in these wonderful questions on this novel practice. I look forward to future updates. Hopefully we can invite you all back maybe for webinars as you get more data collected to provide updates on how this practice is performing. So thank you all for coming today and have a wonderful afternoon.